The envelope slid across the sleek marble table with a sound that sent a chill through me. Inside was a check for $750,000, and Jonathan Fields was smiling like he had just solved all his problems with one stroke of the pen. He leaned back in his chair, the confidence in his posture as clear as the smug expression on his face. I could see it in his eyes. He thought he had me. Thought I was just some guy who could be bought, some naive soul willing to take his money and walk away from everything. What he didn't know, though, was that the woman sitting across from him, the one he thought he was buying off with his flashy check, was my wife. And she controlled more of his company than he'd ever imagined. My name is Lucas Knight, and this is the story of how I watched my wife's family try to tear me down while I quietly held the future of their business in my hands. 5 years ago, I married Olivia Fields, the daughter of one of Miami's most prominent tech entrepreneurs, Jonathan Fields. He built Synteco Technologies from the ground up, a company that had become the crown jewel of the local tech industry. Olivia was everything anyone could hope for: smart, driven, and incredibly beautiful. I'd known her for years before we got married, and our love story wasn't one of instant fireworks. It was something slow and genuine, built on a deep connection that neither of us expected. But from the moment our relationship became public, I knew what would come next: the judgment. The Fields family had high expectations for Olivia, for their business, and for anyone lucky enough to be part of their world. They saw me, a guy working as a mid-level software engineer, and immediately pegged me as someone who'd never measure up. To them, I was someone who had somehow convinced their precious daughter to marry far below her station. But they didn't know the whole story. They didn't know that I had quietly become a player in their world, silently building my own power while they dismissed me as irrelevant. The truth was far more complicated than they could imagine. What they didn't know was that I owned 42% of Synteco Technologies, the very company Jonathan had spent the last decade building. It wasn't something I had ever shared with Olivia, not because I didn't want her to know, but because I needed to watch her family, observe how they treated me, before revealing anything about my true position. In truth, I could have stripped Jonathan of his CEO title with a single phone call and sent him packing. I held enough shares to control the board, to steer the future of their company, but I stayed silent. For years, I stayed in the background, watching, observing, waiting for the right moment to see who they really were when they thought no one was keeping score. That moment was about to come. It started with a simple dinner invitation. A text from Olivia's father, Jonathan, asking us to come over to their house for dinner on Friday. "Just the four of us," he said. "It's urgent." The moment I read the message, I knew exactly what it meant. I'd seen this before. When Jonathan wanted something he didn't ask, he ordered. The word urgent was never just a request. It was code for a meeting with a hidden agenda. They were going to try to push me, force me into a corner, and probably make some offer they thought I couldn't refuse. I had been expecting this for months. They'd been waiting for the right time to try to buy me off, to make me disappear in the way they'd always expected. Olivia, of course, was nervous. "Maybe we should cancel," she said, her lips tight as she handed me her phone, showing me the message. You know how they get when they want something. I took a slow sip of my coffee, my eyes scanning the message again. "No, we're going," I said. My voice was steady, almost too calm. "I want to see what they're really up to this time." She looked at me, her eyes filled with that familiar concern. "Please, Lucas, don't let them get to you." I squeezed her hand, giving her a reassuring smile. "They won't. I just want to see how far they'll push it." And so, on that Friday evening, I found myself walking toward their estate in Coconut Grove, ready to face the family who had underestimated me from day one. The air in Miami was warm and heavy, with that particular kind of tension that comes just before a storm. And as I held Olivia's hand, I knew this dinner would be the beginning of something far bigger than I had anticipated. The calm before the storm. The truth was far more complicated than they could imagine. Olivia, with her radiant smile and effortless charm, was their daughter, their princess. And yet, somehow, I was the one she chose. The man they looked down on. The man who didn't fit into their world of wealth, power, and legacy. I was just a software engineer, a regular guy. To them, I was the underdog who didn't belong in their circle, someone who had somehow tricked their daughter into marrying beneath her station. I didn't have the Ivy League pedigree, the expensive wardrobe, or the yacht for family vacations. In their eyes, I was a nobody, a blip on the radar, easily dismissed. What they didn't know was that I had spent years quietly building my own empire. Sure, I had started as a mid-level software engineer, but I had a plan. A plan that didn't involve flashy cars or suits. It didn't involve showing off wealth. It involved quietly slipping into the financial world, learning the ins and outs, and positioning myself as someone with enough influence to shift the tides when needed. The moment I met Olivia, I had no idea that I would fall in love with her. But I did, and it became clear early on that the love we shared wasn't something her family would easily accept. They would always see me as the outsider, the man who wasn't good enough for their daughter. I tried to prove them wrong, tried to show them that I wasn't defined by my job title or my lack of a high-profile background. I loved Olivia not for the wealth she had, but for the person she was. But my silence in the face of their disapproval wasn't because I didn't have anything to say. It was because I was playing a bigger game, one they couldn't see. I had been accumulating shares in their family business for years. Slowly, stealthily, through holding companies and financial intermediaries that made it impossible to trace back to me. By the time I married Olivia, I owned 35% of Synteco Technologies. At the time, no one knew, not even Olivia. I had always kept that part of my life separate from our personal relationship. The last thing I wanted was for her to feel like I was manipulating her or using our marriage as a way to gain access to her family's wealth. But the truth was, I had a stake in their future, a very large stake. By the time I made my final purchase, I had 42% of the company, making me the largest individual shareholder in Synteco. Jonathan, for all his success, owned only 18%. The rest was owned by institutional investors. But that was a delicate balance. One phone call from me, one move in the boardroom, and I could strip Jonathan of his CEO title. I had always known that, but I never wanted to use it. Not unless I had to. But now, as I sat across from him, watching him smile like he had all the power in the room, I knew the time had come. This dinner wasn't just about a casual family gathering. It was about something far more calculated. He thought he could offer me a check and a clean break from Olivia, as if I was just a businessman who could be bought. To him, this was a negotiation. To me, it was an opportunity to finally take control, to show him the truth about who I was and what I had quietly built over the years. Olivia had no idea about the extent of my holdings. I had kept it that way because I wanted her to see me for who I was, not for the money I could bring to the table. But tonight, as I sat across from Jonathan and Claire, I could feel the tension in the room. Olivia shifted in her seat, sensing that something was different. She didn't know it yet, but I was about to show her family exactly who I was, who I'd always been. And the person they had underestimated for years was about to reveal his power. Jonathan slid a leather folder across the table toward me, his smile still in place, as though he was about to make me an offer I couldn't refuse. The folder was thick with papers, and I knew what it contained. The deal, the price, and the moment of truth. "Lucas," he began, his voice changing to one that was almost patronizing. "Claire and I have been thinking about Olivia's future, and we want to make sure she's always taken care of. She's given up a lot to be with you. Her life, her opportunities, it's all changed." The weight of his words hit me like a punch. He didn't see Olivia's choice to marry me as something she did out of love. He saw it as something she gave up for the sake of her happiness. The arrogance in his tone, the assumption that he could buy my silence with a check, made my blood boil. I had always known that he thought he could control everything, but this was the moment that would change everything. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I just sat there, my fingers running over the folder in front of me, ready to play the cards I had been holding for so long. Jonathan didn't know it yet, but tonight wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. This was my move. I leaned back in my chair, pretending to consider Jonathan's words, my eyes flicking to Olivia, who was staring at the folder with a mixture of confusion and concern. I could feel her hand tremble slightly beneath the table, but she didn't pull away. I could tell she was trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to understand what her father was really offering. But I knew she wasn't going to get it yet, not until I made it clear. Jonathan, with his smile that never quite reached his eyes, continued to speak, as though he was doing me a favor. Olivia's had to sacrifice so much to be with you, he repeated, his voice smooth, like he was making an enlightened decision. This annulment agreement will help both of you move on with your lives. You'll get a fresh start, Olivia can continue her work with the charity, and you'll be compensated for your troubles. It's a fair offer. A generous one, actually. I could feel the weight of the check sitting between us, almost like it was mocking me. He had no idea how badly I wanted to tear it in half, to throw it back in his face, to show him that his money, his power, didn't mean a damn thing to me. But I knew this moment wasn't about just making a point. It was about taking control, showing him that his wealth and arrogance didn't make him invincible. They didn't even make him as powerful as he thought. Generous, I repeated, my voice calm, almost amused. That's one way to put it. I let the words hang in the air between us. I could see Jonathan's smile falter slightly, but he quickly recovered, pretending that he was still in charge of the conversation. It was almost laughable. I let out a slow breath, letting the silence stretch on just a little longer. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, someone who had been playing a long game and was now in the final moments of bringing it all to light. I picked up the check slowly, running my fingers over the number, feeling the crispness of the paper, the weight of the money in my hand. So, let me get this straight, I said, holding the check up to the light. You're offering me $750,000 to sign away my marriage to Olivia? To walk away from everything we've built together? Jonathan's eyes narrowed. It's an annulment, not a divorce, he said quickly, as if that made it any better. No fault, no mess, just a clean break. And you'll be set for life. You'll have your freedom, and Olivia can move on with a fresh start. This is a win-win. I stared at him, the absurdity of the situation almost making me laugh. He thought I was just another opportunist who would take the money and run, as if I could be bought off like a minor player in his game. But he was wrong. I wasn't just some guy looking for a payout. I wasn't the guy who lived in a small apartment and drove a used car because I couldn't afford anything better. I wasn't the guy who wanted to escape into some quiet life, far from Olivia and her family. No. I was someone who had played the long game. Someone who understood that real power wasn't about the flashy displays of wealth, the yachts, or the high-end cars. It was about knowing where to place your bets. And I had placed my bets on Cintico. Quietly, strategically, for years. I could feel Olivia's eyes on me, but I didn't look at her. I couldn't afford to break my focus now. If she knew what I was about to do, if she understood the gravity of the situation, it would change everything for her. But I knew she'd have to see it for herself. I had to let her witness this moment of realization. This was the moment when everything shifted. This was the moment when her family would finally understand who they were dealing with. I put the check back down on the table, slowly and deliberately, letting it rest in front of Jonathan. You're offering me money to walk away from Olivia, to walk away from everything I've ever wanted. You think that's going to solve anything? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Jonathan opened his mouth, but I didn't let him speak. But you don't realize something, I said, cutting him off. You don't realize that while you've been playing your little game, I've been playing mine. And my game isn't about money, it's about control. I stood up then, letting the weight of the moment settle in the room. I could feel the tension building. Olivia was still silent, her face a mixture of confusion and shock. She didn't know yet, but I was about to show her the truth. The truth about me. The truth about how I had been quietly pulling the strings all along. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. Excuse me for just a moment, I said, stepping away from the table. The tension in the room was palpable. Olivia's eyes followed me, but she didn't say anything. She didn't know what was coming next. I dialed George Matthews, my lawyer. George, it's Lucas. I need the latest report on Cintico's ownership structure. Right now. There was a brief pause, and then George's voice came through. Got it, Lucas. Cintico has 100 million shares outstanding. The largest shareholder is your holding company, which owns 42 million shares, making you the largest individual shareholder. Jonathan Fields owns 18 million shares, and the rest is spread across institutional and private investors. I pressed the speakerphone button, letting the voice of my lawyer fill the room. I turned to Jonathan, who was now visibly uncomfortable. His smirk had faded, and his posture had stiffened. "Jonathan," I said, my voice calm, but with a touch of finality, "would you like to hear the current ownership structure of your company?" His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The realization was beginning to hit him, but he still didn't understand the full weight of what I was saying. "George," I said, without breaking eye contact with Jonathan, "go ahead and explain it to him." George's voice came through clearly. "Lucas Knight's holding company, Knight Investments, owns 42% of Synteco, making him the largest single shareholder. Lucas Knight is also the primary decision maker for the majority of the company's board votes, including any changes to executive leadership." I could see Jonathan's face change in an instant. His jaw tightened, his breathing became shallow. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected me. I stood there for a moment, letting it all sink in. "You've been running Synteco for years, Jonathan," I said, my voice low and controlled. "But you've never asked yourself who's been really keeping it afloat." I smiled, feeling a sense of power surge through me. "The man you tried to pay off is the one who holds the keys to your company." The room was silent now, the weight of the moment hanging in the air. Jonathan's world had just crumbled, and I was the one who had brought it down. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. Jonathan's face had gone from pale to a deep crimson as the reality of the situation hit him. His smug confidence from earlier had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of panic that only comes when someone realizes they've lost control of everything they thought they had. Claire sat there, her eyes wide, still processing what had just unfolded. I could see the gears turning in her head, but she was too stunned to speak. Olivia's gaze shifted from me to Jonathan, back to me again. She was confused, her brow furrowing as she tried to piece it all together. The shock in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't suspected a thing. She hadn't known the depth of my involvement with Synteco. I could feel her wanting to say something, to ask me why I'd kept this secret from her, but I knew I couldn't explain it all at once. This moment wasn't just for Jonathan and Claire. It was for her, too. She needed to see the truth for herself. "Lucas," Jonathan finally managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. This can't be right. You're just a data analyst. You live in a tiny apartment and drive that old car." His words stumbled over themselves, but his eyes were focused on me, searching for any sign that I was bluffing. "You can't possibly be the one controlling all of this." I stood up slowly, walking around the table, feeling the weight of Jonathan's words and how far off the mark they were. It had always been about appearances for him. The money, the car, the house, everything he saw as a measure of worth. And yet here I was, the man who had quietly kept his empire intact while he spent his time trying to hold on to what he thought was his. The hypocrisy of it all was almost overwhelming. Jonathan had spent years building Synteco, but he had never bothered to truly understand how it worked, who was really propping it up, or where his future lay. He was too caught up in his pride, in making sure the world saw him as the one in charge. I stopped beside him, my hands resting on the back of the chair where he was sitting. His eyes flicked nervously to the check still lying in front of him. I could feel his desperation now. He had thought he was offering me a way out, a tidy solution to the problem of my existence in his daughter's life. But now, the table had turned. He was the one trapped, and I was the one holding the keys. "You think money can buy everything, Jonathan," I said, my voice low, controlled. "But what you don't realize is that money can't buy loyalty. It can't buy love, and it certainly can't buy respect. You thought you could use this check to solve your problems. You thought I'd just take it and leave Olivia like a dog with a bone, but you've never understood me or the way I operate." I let that sink in, watching him shift uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't come here tonight to be bought, Jonathan. I didn't come here for your money. What you failed to see, what you'll never understand, is that I don't need your approval. And I certainly don't need a check to walk away from the woman I love. I could feel Olivia's presence beside me now. She hadn't said a word, but I could sense her tension, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. I wasn't sure what she was thinking, but I could see the realization dawning on her. The way she held herself, the way her hands were trembling ever so slightly. She was starting to connect the dots. She was starting to understand that her family wasn't just trying to control her life. They were trying to control me. And they had never once considered that I might be the one holding all the power. I turned my attention back to Jonathan, whose face had turned a shade of red that could rival the summer sun. He was sweating now, his attempt to maintain control falling apart at the seams. I could see his mind racing, trying to figure out a way to salvage the situation, to twist things back in his favor. But it was too late. "You've always thought that your wealth and influence would keep you on top," I continued, my voice a little sharper now. "But you're looking at this all wrong. Your wealth is just a tool, a means to an end. You've built a legacy, yes, but you've built it on unstable ground. You thought it was yours, but you never even bothered to ask who else was contributing to your success." Jonathan opened his mouth to speak again, but this time I stopped him. I wasn't going to let him talk his way out of this. "No, Jonathan, it's too late for words. The board's been notified. The meeting's scheduled. Monday morning, the vote happens. You're out as CEO." I could see the color drain from his face. The fight had left him replaced by a look of disbelief. The man who had thought himself invincible was now facing the truth. He wasn't the one in control. I was. "I didn't want to do this," I said, my voice quieter now, but resolute. "I didn't want to hurt your company. I didn't want to hurt you. But you made this happen. You chose to dismiss me, to try and buy me off. And now it's too late for apologies. Monday, you'll be removed from your position, and the company will finally be run the way it should have been from the start." The room was still. The weight of what I had just said hung between us, heavy and undeniable. Jonathan, the man who had built a company from nothing, was no longer the one in charge. I was. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. I turned to Olivia then, my eyes softening. She still hadn't said anything, still hadn't fully processed everything I had just revealed, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. She had been a part of this world without knowing the full truth. Now she had to face it. I walked over to her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner," I said quietly, "but I needed you to see who your family really is, and I needed you to understand who I really am." She met my gaze, her expression torn. The silence between us spoke volumes. It wasn't just about the company or about Jonathan's power. It was about us, about trust, and about the life we were trying to build together. She didn't say anything at first, but after a long moment she reached up and took my hand. "I know," she whispered. "I know." And in that moment, I realized that no matter what happened with the Fields family, I had already won. Because Olivia and I, we were on the same side now. And that was all that mattered. The air in the room was thick with tension, heavy with unspoken words, and the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Jonathan sat there, his face still frozen in disbelief, the check he had offered me now lying untouched on the table, an empty gesture that meant nothing anymore. Claire, who had been silent for what felt like an eternity, finally stirred, her eyes flicking from Jonathan to me, then to Olivia, as though she was trying to piece together what had just happened. Olivia's hand was still in mine, her fingers trembling slightly, as if she couldn't quite grasp the enormity of the situation. I could feel the confusion radiating off her, her mind working through the shock of everything I had just revealed. The truth about Cintico, the truth about my role in it, and the truth about the man she had married. I had kept so much from her, and now it was all spilling out in a way neither of us had ever imagined. The weight of her silence was almost unbearable, but I couldn't rush this. She needed time to process it, just like I had needed time to come to terms with the man her family really was. "Lucas?" Olivia finally spoke, her voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. She looked up at me, searching my face for any sign of what I had been hiding. "Why didn't you tell me? Why keep all of this from me?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I knew this was coming, but hearing it, seeing the hurt in her eyes, made it feel 1,000 times heavier. I took a deep breath, letting the weight of it all settle. I didn't want you to feel like I was using you, Olivia. I didn't want to become just another piece in your family's game. You needed to see me for who I am, not because of the shares I own or the money I've invested. I wanted you to choose me, not my wealth, not my connections, but me. And I needed to know that your family would accept me for who I am, not who they thought I should be. Olivia's eyes softened, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of understanding in her gaze. She took a slow, deep breath and then, to my surprise, smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was enough to let me know that she was beginning to make sense of it all. She wasn't angry. She wasn't upset. She was just processing. "Lucas, I love you," she said quietly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "But this is a lot. I never saw this coming." She glanced at her parents, and I could see the struggle on her face as she tried to make sense of everything that had just happened. This whole time, I thought I was the one who had to choose between you and them, but I didn't realize I was caught in the middle of something so much bigger. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held my gaze firmly. "But I chose you, and nothing changes that." Those words, simple and honest, hit me harder than anything else that night. They weren't just words, they were a promise. Olivia had seen the truth for herself. She had recognized that this wasn't just about her family's power or wealth. It was about us, about our relationship, and about the trust we had built. And in that moment, I realized how much I had underestimated her strength. She wasn't just standing by me. She was standing up to her family, to everything they had tried to impose on her. I squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her decision. "I know this is a lot, Olivia, but I promise you, I'm not doing this to hurt anyone. I never wanted this to be a power struggle. I just wanted to be with you, to be who I am, and to see if your family could accept me for that. I wasn't trying to play a game. But now that we're here, now that they've shown who they really are, I can't just walk away from that. I won't." Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and shaky. "You're really doing this?" he asked, looking at me like he couldn't believe what was happening. His world, the one he thought was solid and unshakable, had just been upended, and he didn't know how to process it. He was the man who had always been in control, the man who had built a company from the ground up, and yet here I was, the man who held the power to tear it all down. I stood up, straightening my jacket, my gaze never leaving Jonathan's. "I didn't want to do this, Jonathan, but you made me. You tried to buy me off. You thought money would fix everything, but it doesn't. It never will, not with me." I turned to Olivia, my eyes softening as I spoke to her. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner, but this is the truth. This is the reality of what I've been doing, and now it's time for your family to face it." I looked back at Jonathan and Claire, who were still sitting there, completely stunned by everything that had just happened. "The board has already been notified. The meeting is set for Monday. This is no longer about just us. This is about the future of Syntico." Jonathan's face twisted in frustration. "You can't do this, Lucas. I built this company. It's mine." "You built it, but you almost destroyed it, Jonathan," I replied, my voice firm. "You were drowning in debt. You couldn't secure financing when you needed it. It was my money, my investments, that kept this company afloat all these years. And now, the bill has come due. It's time for someone else to take over." Olivia stood up slowly, walking over to me and placing a hand on my arm. She didn't say anything, but her touch was enough. She was with me. She had made her choice. The last of the tension between us had lifted, and in its place, there was only clarity. "I love you, Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "and I'm with you, no matter what happens." That was all I needed to hear. This was the moment when everything changed. Not because of the money, not because of the company, but because Olivia and I were finally on the same page. We weren't fighting her family anymore. We were fighting for each other. And that was more than enough. The next few days passed in a blur. Olivia and I didn't speak much about the dinner afterward. Not immediately. The weight of everything that had happened between us, between me and her family, was too much to unpack in the immediate aftermath. I knew she needed time to process it all, just like I did. But something in the way she held my hand, the quiet trust in her eyes, made me feel like we were closer than ever. There was no more tension between us. She had made her choice. She had chosen me, and I could feel that certainty radiating off her in everything she did. But for the rest of the world, for Jonathan and Claire, the storm was far from over. I spent the weekend preparing for the board meeting on Monday. I wasn't worried. I knew what needed to be done, and the steps to take were clear. I had already spoken to the other major shareholders, the ones who held enough sway to ensure the vote would go in my favor. But it wasn't just about the business. It was about sending a message to Jonathan, to Claire, and to everyone else in that room. It wasn't just about controlling a company. It was about showing them who was really in charge, who had been behind the scenes all this time. And it wasn't Jonathan Fields. Monday morning arrived, and I found myself walking into the Synteco headquarters, the place Jonathan had called home for the past decade, with an entirely different perspective. I had walked these halls before, but now it felt different. I was no longer an outsider, a small player. Now, I was the one in control, the one who held the power to make or break this company. The weight of it was almost surreal. I entered the boardroom, where the majority of the board members were already seated, waiting for the meeting to begin. There was an air of uncertainty among them. They knew why they were there, but none of them knew exactly what was coming. Jonathan and Claire were late, a fact that wasn't lost on anyone. They had no idea the extent of my involvement in the company, and by the time they walked in, it would be too late. The doors opened, and Jonathan and Claire entered, their expressions a mix of disbelief and resignation. They hadn't expected the meeting to go this way. But here we were, and I could see the panic in Jonathan's eyes, his confidence shattered as he took his seat at the head of the table. Claire, ever the poised figure, sat beside him, but her gaze flickered nervously between Jonathan and the rest of the board members. They knew their world was collapsing, and they were powerless to stop it. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice steady as I addressed the room. The tension was palpable, but I wasn't going to let that throw me off. "Thank you for joining us today. As you all know, this meeting has been called to discuss a change in leadership here at Synteco." I paused, letting the words sink in. The looks exchanged around the room told me everything I needed to know. They had been waiting for this moment. They knew Jonathan's time had come. Jonathan's mouth tightened as he opened it to speak, but I wasn't going to let him take control of the narrative. Before we proceed with the agenda, I'd like to introduce something, or rather, someone, that has been at the heart of this company's survival for the last few years, I said, turning to George Matthews, who had been quietly observing from the back. I nodded at him, and he stepped forward, handing out copies of the latest shareholder report. As the board members began reading through the document, the room fell silent. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes flicking nervously between George and me. Claire's face went pale as the realization hit her. The numbers didn't lie. "Lucas," Jonathan finally said, his voice shaking, "this is ridiculous. You can't just take over like this. I built Synteco. I made this company what it is." His voice had lost the edge of authority it once held, replaced by desperation. I looked at him calmly. "You built Synteco, Jonathan. Yes, but you nearly destroyed it in the process. You overextended yourself, and when the company was on the brink of collapse, it was my investments, my strategic moves that kept this business afloat. You've relied on people like me to save you, and now I'm here to make sure Synteco has a future." The board members looked at each other, some of them nodding in agreement, others still processing what was happening. But in that moment, I knew they understood. They understood that I wasn't just a shadow in the background anymore. I was the one calling the shots. "Are you really going to do this?" Jonathan spat, his voice laced with fury. "You're taking my company away from me, from my family. You're nothing but a—" "I'm nothing but the man who saved you, Jonathan," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "And you've spent the last few years acting like you're invincible, like no one could touch you. But the truth is, you've been under my thumb all along. You just didn't know it." The room was silent again, the truth hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Jonathan's face had drained of color. Claire was staring at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. They had spent so long thinking they controlled everything, But they had never realized that power wasn't in the flashy appearances or the show of wealth. It was in the quiet control, in the decisions made behind closed doors. The board began voting shortly after, and it didn't take long for the results to come in. Jonathan was out as CEO, effective immediately. The majority of the board had voted in favor of the leadership change, and it was clear. Sinteco's future was no longer in his hands. I turned to Olivia, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room, watching it all unfold. She gave me a small, reassuring smile, and I knew we had done the right thing. The weight of the situation was still there, but there was something else now too. Relief. This was the moment when everything changed, not just for the company, but for our lives. Jonathan had lost, but Olivia and I, we had won. We had taken control of our future, and nothing, not even her family's expectations, would ever take that away from us. As we walked out of the boardroom together, I felt like I was walking into a new chapter of our lives. It was a chapter where we could finally breathe, free from the constraints of the past, free to build something real, something that mattered. The days following the board meeting were a whirlwind, and it wasn't just about the aftermath with Sinteco. The tension between Olivia and her parents was thick, like an invisible wall that neither of us knew how to tear down. I had expected some fallout, but the emotional weight of it was still more than I had anticipated. As much as I had stood firm in my decision to reveal the truth, Olivia was caught in the middle, her world forever altered by the choices I had made. She had been incredibly strong, far stronger than I could have imagined, but I could see the cracks forming. Her family's reaction, especially Jonathan's desperate attempts to salvage what little control he had left, had shaken her. She was torn between loyalty to me and the deep-rooted love she still felt for her parents. As much as I wanted to protect her from all of this, I knew she had to face it. Face the truth about the family that had always treated me like a pawn in their game. The night after the vote was particularly difficult. Olivia and I sat in our small apartment, the one we had chosen to live in when we first got together, the place we had shared so many memories. There was something about the simplicity of it, something that felt right, even as the world around us seemed to spiral out of control. Olivia sat beside me on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, staring out the window at the city lights that flickered like distant stars. She hadn't said much all evening, and I knew she was struggling to put words to everything she was feeling. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was just heavy, the kind of silence that comes after a storm has passed, but before you can really see the damage. "Do you think they'll ever accept me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a question I knew was coming, but hearing it still hit me like a punch to the gut. Olivia wasn't just asking about her parents' approval. She was asking if their opinion of her was ever going to change, if their belief that she had made a mistake in marrying me would ever fade. I took a deep breath, turning to face her. "I don't know, Liv," I said honestly, my voice quiet. "I wish I could give you a straight answer. I wish I could tell you that everything's going to be okay, that your parents will come around, and everything will go back to normal." She looked at me then, her eyes wide, and I could see the vulnerability in them. She was still my Olivia, the strong, independent woman I had fallen in love with, but she was also someone who had grown up in a world where family was everything. And that world had just cracked. The weight of it was starting to sink in. "But I do know one thing," I continued, my voice steady despite the turmoil I felt inside. "You and I, we've built something real. And no matter what happens with your parents, no matter what they say or how they act, I'll always be here. I'll always choose you." Her lips trembled as she let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her emotions started to show. But instead of pulling away, instead of retreating into herself, she leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder as she let out a long sigh. "I don't know what to feel anymore," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Lucas. I always have. But they've been so much a part of my life, and now everything feels so messed up." I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tightly. "I know, Liv. I know. This is a lot. It's not easy, and I never wanted to put you in this position. But we'll get through this. Together." We sat there for what felt like hours, wrapped in the silence of our apartment. But this time, the silence wasn't oppressive. It was comforting. It was us, processing everything in our own way. The next few days were a mix of difficult conversations and moments of quiet understanding. Olivia called her parents, but the calls were brief, and the tension on both sides was palpable. Jonathan's anger had yet to subside, and Claire, as always, tried to keep things civil. But it was clear that they were struggling to accept the reality of their new place in the world, a world where their power no longer had the same weight. Olivia was caught between trying to ease their hurt and protect me from the venom that still lingered in their words. One evening, after another failed attempt at a family conversation, Olivia came back to our apartment, her face tired but determined. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table, her fingers tapping nervously on the wood. "I spoke to them today," she said, her voice low. "They're upset, obviously, but I think they're starting to see things differently. Jonathan is still angry, but Claire, she's starting to get it." I nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "How do you feel about that?" I asked gently. Olivia exhaled, rubbing her eyes with the back of her hand. "I don't know, Lucas. I don't know if I'm ready to forgive them yet. I'm not even sure if they deserve to be forgiven, but maybe they're trying." She looked at me, her gaze softening. "Maybe we just need time." I smiled, a small, reassuring smile. "We have all the time we need, Liv. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you." The tension between us, between me and her family, wasn't gone. It might never fully disappear. But what we had built together, was real. And it was enough to get us through whatever came next. Olivia's smile was small but genuine. And for the first time in days, I felt like we were on the same side again, facing the future together. The days after Olivia's conversation with her parents were quieter, but not in the way I expected. The tension that had hung between us, thick as fog, was still there, lingering in the background. But it was different now. Less about anger, more about uncertainty. I could tell Olivia was still processing everything, still trying to reconcile the love she had for her family with the reality of what had just happened. It wasn't easy. I knew that. I knew how hard it was to change the way you saw the people you loved most. But I also knew that we were stronger for having gone through it together. I spent the next few days out of the office, finalizing some plans for the changes that were going to happen at Syntico. It felt surreal, knowing that everything I had worked toward for years, quietly, behind the scenes, was finally coming to fruition. The board had confirmed the leadership change, and the transition would happen in stages, but the real work had already begun. Jonathan's removal as CEO was a done deal. The next step was making sure Syntico was in the right hands, hands that could actually build on what had been created, rather than destroying it through pride and mismanagement. But as much as I was focused on the company, I couldn't ignore the other elephant in the room: my relationship with Olivia's parents. They hadn't given up entirely. Claire was trying, in her own way, to find some middle ground between me and Jonathan's vision of what family should look like. But Jonathan? He hadn't come to terms with what had happened. He was still angry, still reeling from the fact that someone he had always considered beneath him had taken control of everything he thought was his. And as much as I wanted to let it go, as much as I didn't want to get sucked back into the drama, I knew that my relationship with Olivia's parents wasn't something I could simply ignore. One afternoon, as I sat at our kitchen table, going over some final adjustments to the company's restructuring plan, Olivia came into the room, her phone in hand. I could see the hesitation in her posture, the way she lingered at the door, almost like she was unsure of how to approach me. "Lucas," she began, her voice soft, "I think it's time I talk to my dad. He wants to meet." I set my laptop aside, focusing on her. I knew what this was. The offer had been extended before, a conversation with Jonathan, a chance to clear the air, to rebuild what had been broken. I had no doubt in my mind that Jonathan was still clinging to the idea that he could somehow regain control, somehow fix everything by making a deal with me. But this wasn't about deals anymore. It wasn't about power or pride. It was about honesty and about rebuilding something real. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" I asked her. My voice wasn't judgmental, but it was filled with concern. I could see the weight of the decision in her eyes, and I didn't want her to rush into anything before she was truly ready. Olivia hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking down to her phone and then back up to meet my gaze. I don't know, Lucas. I really don't. But I think it's time. I need to know if we can rebuild something with him, or if it's just too broken. I nodded, understanding her struggle. I could see the internal battle she was fighting. This wasn't just about her father's company anymore. It was about her family, the values she had grown up with, and whether or not she could reconcile that with the person she was now. The person she was becoming. You don't have to do it alone, Liv, I said quietly. If you want me there, I'll be with you. I know this is hard, but we've been through a lot already. Whatever happens, I'm here. She smiled, a small but grateful smile, before taking a seat beside me. I know. I just don't know how this conversation will go. Neither do I replied, chuckling softly. But I do know one thing. You've already made your decision. You've chosen me. You've chosen us. I took her hand in mine, squeezing it gently, and no matter how this conversation goes, we'll get through it together. Olivia leaned her head on my shoulder, her fingers tracing the lines of my hand as if grounding herself in the present. I just wish things didn't have to be this complicated. It's like everything's falling apart, but I don't want to lose my family. I don't want you to lose them either, I said, my voice soft but firm. But sometimes, Liv, people have to go through things to see who they really are. Maybe this is that time for your parents. Maybe this is where they realize what really matters. I hope so, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. That evening, Olivia agreed to meet with Jonathan the following day. I could see the mix of apprehension and determination in her eyes. She was going to face him, not as his daughter, not as someone caught in the middle, but as herself. Someone who had made her own choices. Someone who had chosen love over expectation. I didn't know what would come of the meeting. Maybe it would lead to a new chapter with her parents. Maybe it wouldn't. But what mattered was that Olivia was ready to take that step, to confront the past, and to do it on her own terms. I would be there for her, no matter the outcome. The rest of the night was quieter than usual, the kind of quiet that comes after a decision has been made, but before you see where it will take you. We didn't speak much after she'd made her decision, but the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was a shared understanding that we were both preparing ourselves for whatever was next. Whatever came from Olivia's meeting with Jonathan, whatever came from this fractured family, we were in it together. And for the first time in days, I felt at peace. We were facing the future, and that was enough for me. The morning of the meeting with Jonathan came too soon. I could tell from the way Olivia was moving around our apartment, gathering her things, getting ready, that she was deep in thought. There was a stillness about her, a quiet determination that I hadn't seen before. It was as if the woman who walked into this situation weeks ago had transformed into someone new. Someone who had come to terms with the fact that her family, her father, might never accept everything she had chosen. But she was going to face it anyway. She wasn't running. She wasn't avoiding the hard truths. She was confronting them head on. Liv, I said, my voice steady but gentle as I walked into the kitchen. She was adjusting her jacket, trying to look poised despite the uncertainty that still lingered in her eyes. I could see the way her hands shook ever so slightly, the way she kept pulling at the hem of her sleeve, trying to keep it together. She looked up at me, her eyes searching for reassurance, and in that moment, I knew what she needed to hear. You don't have to do this for him, you know. You don't have to fix anything for him. She nodded slowly, a quiet breath escaping her lips as she placed her hands on the counter. I know. I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing this for me. For us. I felt a sense of pride swell in my chest. She had come so far in such a short time. From the girl who had clung to her family's expectations to the woman who was now choosing her own path. The weight of what she was doing, walking into that room, facing Jonathan, and letting him see that she wasn't the little girl he could control anymore, was not lost on me. I didn't know how the conversation would go, but I knew one thing for sure. Olivia had already taken control of her own life. I walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder, pulling her into a quick but reassuring hug. Whatever happens today, you've already made your decision. You've chosen to live for you, and I'll be right beside you, always." She smiled, a fragile but genuine smile that softened the tension in her face. "Thank you," she whispered. When we arrived at Jonathan's office, the familiar high-rise building, the polished marble floors, and the sleek modern design of his company's headquarters seemed almost like a distant memory. Walking through the halls felt like walking through a place I had once feared, a world I didn't belong to. But today was different. Today, I wasn't the outsider. Today, I was the one with control, with the power to decide how the next chapter of Olivia's life would unfold. Olivia's hand was in mine as we walked into the conference room where Jonathan and Claire were waiting. The tension was palpable. Jonathan was seated at the head of the table, his usual air of authority replaced by something else, frustration, maybe even a bit of fear. Claire sat beside him, her posture stiff, her eyes not meeting mine as we entered the room. "Olivia Lucas," Jonathan said, his voice tight with forced calm. "I'm glad you could make it. Please, have a seat." We sat down across from them, and the silence that filled the room was uncomfortable, suffocating even. I could feel Olivia's hand twitch in mine, but she didn't pull away. She was here to do what she needed to do, and I could sense the strength she was drawing from within. Jonathan cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Olivia, I don't understand why we're here. You've made your choice, but this is a mistake. You're letting someone like him pull you away from your family. You know you belong with us. Your life, your future, it's all here." I could feel Olivia's grip tighten around my hand, but she didn't look at me. She didn't need to. I knew what she was thinking. This was the moment she had been dreading. This was where her father would try to convince her to choose him again, to choose the life he had mapped out for her instead of the life she was building for herself. She took a deep breath, looking directly at Jonathan. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but full of resolve. "I didn't make this decision lightly. I've spent so many years trying to balance who you wanted me to be with who I am. But I can't keep doing that. I can't keep living my life trying to meet expectations that I don't even agree with. I love you, but I have to live for me. I have to live for us." Jonathan's face darkened, his anger flaring just beneath the surface. "You think I've never wanted what's best for you? I've given you everything, Olivia. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, I've done it for you." "I know, Dad," Olivia replied softly, "but your idea of what's best for me isn't the same as mine. It's not enough for me anymore." Her words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, I thought Jonathan might lash out. But instead, he sat back in his chair, his jaw tight, as though the weight of Olivia's words had struck him harder than any insult. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice low. "I don't understand why you would choose him over us." Olivia's expression softened just enough that I knew she wasn't trying to hurt him. But she was resolute, and for the first time in all these years, she wasn't letting him dictate the terms of her life. "I'm not choosing him over you, Dad," she said, her voice firm. "I'm choosing myself, and maybe that's something you need to start doing too." She paused, letting the silence settle between them. "I want us to have a real relationship, but I need you to accept who I am, who I've become, before we can move forward. I need you to respect my choices. All of them." The room was still. Jonathan sat there, speechless for a long moment. Claire finally met my gaze, her face strained, but something flickered in her eyes. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was understanding. But something had shifted. Jonathan finally exhaled sharply, pushing back his chair. "I don't know if I can do that," he said, his voice cracked with emotion. "I've always wanted what was best for you. I don't know if I can accept this." Olivia stood up then, her eyes filled with quiet determination. "Maybe not today, Dad, but someday. I hope someday you will." As we walked out of the room, Olivia's hand still in mine, I knew that this conversation hadn't fixed everything. It hadn't healed the years of tension or resentment, but it had begun something. A new chapter, where Olivia was free to choose her own path, and where the future, our future, could finally be ours to shape. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence I'd grown used to over the last few weeks. It was different now. It was calm. I could feel the shift between Olivia and me, the unspoken understanding that we had just crossed a threshold. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was ours now. And as much as it pained me to see Olivia caught between two worlds, I knew she had made a choice, and it was the right one for her. She had chosen herself. The car hummed softly as I drove, the city lights flickering around us like distant stars, each one a reminder of how far we had come and how much further we had to go. Olivia was staring out the window, her profile bathed in the glow of the streetlights. She looked tired, but there was something else in her expression, something that hadn't been there before, a quiet strength. "You okay?" I asked, my voice soft, breaking the silence. She turned her head slowly, not offering me a small but genuine smile. "Yeah, I think so." She paused, her gaze shifting to her hands, fidgeting in her lap. I didn't expect him to react like that. I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He's still your father, Liv. It's hard for him to let go, to admit that things are different, but he's going to have to. "I know," she said, her voice a little more distant now. "It's just, I thought he'd try harder, that maybe he'd try to understand, but it was like he was still holding on to that vision of me, that version of me that he built in his mind." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "I'm not that person anymore. I'm not his little girl." I reached over, my hand covering hers, offering her the comfort she had given me so many times. She squeezed my hand gently, but I could see the strain in her eyes. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of something new, something that would take time to settle. "You're right, you're not," I said quietly, "but you're still his daughter, and he'll have to come to terms with that. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he will." She looked over at me then, her gaze softening. "I know. I just wish it didn't have to be so hard. I wish it didn't feel like I'm losing something every time I choose us." I squeezed her hand, my grip firm. "You're not losing anything, Liv. You're just finally choosing what's best for you. And for us, this is what you needed to do. I've never seen you more sure of anything in your life." Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something more, but she didn't. She just nodded, her eyes growing distant again as the weight of her words settled in. I knew she wasn't just talking about the conversation with Jonathan. She was talking about the years of living in his shadow, of carrying his expectations as if they were her own. She was talking about the choices she had made in the past, the ones she had allowed him to dictate, and the way they had shaped her life until now. The rest of the drive was filled with an unspoken understanding. Olivia didn't need to say anything more. She was tired, mentally and emotionally, but there was a quiet satisfaction in the way she held herself, the way she finally seemed at peace with her decision. The tension between us, that invisible weight I hadn't even realized we had been carrying, seemed to lift. When we pulled into the parking lot of our apartment complex, I stopped the car and turned off the engine. Olivia didn't move at first, staring out at the building before us, her gaze distant. For a moment, it felt like we were back where we started, at the beginning of everything. But this time, the uncertainty was gone. We had both made our choices, and now we were going to have to live with them, together. "I'm proud of you, Liv," I said quietly, breaking the silence between us. She turned to me, her expression softening as she gave me a small smile. "Thanks, Lucas. I'm proud of you too, for everything." We sat there for a moment longer, just the two of us, the weight of the world outside our little bubble pressing in on us. But inside the car, inside this moment, it felt like we had everything we needed. We had each other. We walked inside together, hand in hand, our fingers intertwining as we made our way up to our apartment. The building was quiet, as it always was at this time of night, but something felt different about it now. It was ours. Not just a place we lived in, but a home we were building, piece by piece. When we entered our apartment, the familiar scent of coffee and the quiet hum of the refrigerator greeted us. But tonight, the place felt warmer, like it was finally becoming a reflection of who we were, a home built on love, honesty, and the strength to face whatever came next. Olivia kicked off her shoes and made her way to the couch, collapsing onto it with a sigh of relief. I followed her, sitting down beside her, and for a moment, we just sat there in comfortable silence, letting the weight of the day wash over us. "Do you think things will ever be normal again?" Olivia asked softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I smiled, leaning back and resting my arm across the back of the couch. "No, Probably not. But maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe normal was never what we needed. She looked at me, her expression soft, her eyes filled with something like hope. Maybe you're right. And in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be challenges ahead, but we had already made it through the hardest part, together. And that was more than enough. Life is about making choices that align with who you truly are, not who others expect you to be. It's easy to get lost in the pressure to meet others' expectations, but real fulfillment comes from embracing your own path. Don't be afraid to stand up for what you believe in, even if it means challenging those closest to you. Trust in your own strength, even when the road gets tough. Remember, true growth often happens when you step outside your comfort zone, and the courage to choose yourself is the key to building a life you love.